Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we have several developments across the front line in favor of the Russians. The Russians have advanced within the city of Chasiv Yar, have also advanced within the city of Toretsk. In the direction of Pokrovsk, the Russians are infiltrating the second line of defense, reaching within 2.5 kilometers of the outskirts of the city and slowly infiltrating the line of defense which connects to the city itself. Therefore, the fighting over the city has begun, as I mentioned multiple days ago. At the southern flank, the Russians are also pushing towards the western flank of Pokrovsk, where they're looking to cut off the supply roads between Pokrovsk and Dnipro city. At the same time, the Russians have advanced in the northern and southern flanks of Kurakhove, as well as within the city itself. The Russians have also advanced towards Velika Novosilka from the south. Starting out in the southern direction, the Russians have managed to make advances closer towards Velika Novosilka, reaching the outskirts of the settlement from the south, as fighting continues on the northern, eastern and southern flanks of the settlement, while the Russians are also continuing positional fighting on the western flank, where they're looking to gain control over the fortified positions and the supply roads in and out of Velika Novosilka. Further north, the Russians in the direction of Kurakhove have managed to secure the southern flank of Danya as they start pushing towards Uspenivka from the northern direction. They already have a foothold in the eastern parts of Uspenivka, and with this the Russians are looking to close the pocket, which has slowly but steadily shrunk here east of Uspenivka, but still contains 4 settlements, and the Russians, with the capture of the fortified positions north of Uspenivka, would be able to gain full control over the area and completely encircle it to gain full control of it. Therefore, simply fighting the fortified position will force the Ukrainians to withdraw from the pocket to avoid encirclement, and with that the Russians have close proximity to the supply road in and out due to their foothold in the eastern parts of Konstantinopolsk. We see that the only road in and out is this road here in the northwestern parts of Uspenivka through the fortified areas, which the Russians are just within a couple hundred meters away. With that, tanks, artillery, mortars and so on can all strike those positions. Therefore, any forces in or out of Uspenivka would be under fire. At the same time, since it's only one road in or out of Uspenivka, there is constantly drones surveilling the area, which means that anyone driving through will be detected by the Russian forces. Within Kurakhove itself, the Russians have started storming the high-rise apartment complex area in the southern parts of it, gaining a foothold within it and slowly pushing through it. With this, the Russians are slowly advancing across the apartment complex area, both in the central parts as well as in the southern parts of Kurakhove. In the northern flank of Kurakhove, the Russians have secured the railway between Voznesenka and Berezki as they slowly push through the pocket which was formed between Stariterne in the south and Sontsivka in the north, as the Russians look to gain full control of it before pushing onwards towards either Shevchenko in the west or Dashna in the south, or both at the same time. Further north, the Russians have made significant advances here in the direction of Pokrovsk, both directly towards it and in the western flank of it. Just east of Pushkina, the Russians have captured a first line, and this the Russians have full control over the northern, southern and eastern flanks of Pushkina, pushing the Ukrainians out of the settlement and leaving it in a gray zone, where the Russians are also flanking the positions in the next defensive position, which is the settlement of Novo-Olenivka, where the Russians have flanked it from the north. And with this flanking maneuver, the fortified positions north of Ukrainka are in danger of a flanking maneuver of the Russians, which will allow the Russians to gain control over those from their weak points, which will allow the Russians to then push further along the main highway between Pokrovsk in the north and Kurakhove in the south, along the main highway to gain control over the settlements one by one, to then push down towards Andrivka and gain a connection between Kurakhove in the south to Pokrovsk in the north, where the Russians would have control over the highway. At the same time, the Russians are also pushing along the fortified positions to push towards the Dnieper region. And we see that further north, where the Russians are slowly pushing west of Novotretsk before even capturing the remaining parts of the settlement, capturing the majority of the settlement, as well as the geolocated footage confirming these advances. The Russians are moving onwards towards the western outskirts, following which they'll push onwards towards Novovasilivka, towards the western flank of Pokrovsk along the river line to push into the Dnieper region, which has a road connected to Novopavlivka in the southeastern outskirts of the region, which is a settlement that is not only connected here towards Selidove in the east, but also connected to Kurakhove in the south. So it will allow the Russians to flank the Ukrainian positions in the southern parts of the Donetsk region. In the northern direction, the Russians managed to secure several fortified positions and forest lines, as well as the settlement of Shevchenko. The Russians have gained full control of it and are pushing onwards towards the second line of defense of the Ukrainians. There are a few scattered positions, defensive positions of the Ukrainians in the area. The Russians are pushing through one by one, mainly advancing through the railways, but also securing the general fortified positions in the area. The Russians will look to push and flank the first line of defense to the east along Selene, Dashenske, Lysivka, and Chasiv Yar, which will allow the Russians to connect the eastern and western flanks, but also to push upwards towards Pokrovsk to gain a foothold within the apartment complex area in the southern parts of Pokrovsk, and move along the railways to the west, where they look to gain a foothold in the settlements southwest of Pokrovsk to strengthen their siege of the city by starting to attack the supply lines in the western parts, move towards the railways in that direction, where it connects and splits here by Pokrovsk towards Dnipro city. We see that the railways goes all the way from Pokrovsk in the east through the general area and up to Dnipro through the southern direction, and then there's a northern direction through Pavlograd all the way through towards Pokrovsk. This will allow the Russians in the future to have two flanks when advancing towards Dnipro and flanking Zaporizhzhia city itself. As for the positions near the city of Pokrovsk itself, with the capture of Shevchenko, the Russians will now be able to continue their offensive operations in the northern direction, where the Russians will look to gain a foothold within the city of Pokrovsk from the south, flank the defensive lines in the east, and expand the siege in the west. In the direction of Toretsk, there's been a Russian advance near Leonidivka, where the Russians have advanced within the eastern parts of the settlement and towards Sherbinivka as they restart offensive operations north of Nelipivka to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. Now that they have gained control over the waste heaps here to the south of Toretsk, the Russians are now able to have the advantage of the high ground, which will allow them to connect the two sides between the north and the south to push towards Sherbinivka and develop the offensive operations to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians northwest of Toretsk. Therefore, there will likely be a main push coming through the north of Nelipivka towards Sherbinivka and flanking the fortified positions rather than moving through the city of Toretsk once the Russians capture the industrial zone, where they are currently flanking it from the north and from the south at the same time to encircle it. In the direction of Chasiv Yar, the Russians have also managed to advance here to connect the northern and southern flank, which increases the amount of directions the Russians are attacking the central parts of Chasiv Yar from. There will also allow the Russians to continue offensive operations along the residential area in the northern parts of the city and cut off the industrial zone from the apartment complex area, which will be stormed from the eastern and northern directions. In the Kursk direction, there are some updates in the direction of Kurakhove. There are reports by Deep State Map that the Russians managed to push through parts of the Sumy region and back into the Kursk region. However, according to a Russian source, it is not true. They simply advanced along the border area. In either case, it doesn't make any difference. I'm just saying this to explain why I don't have the Ukrainian parts under Russian control, because it simply does not make a difference if they captured this small patch of forest across the border to push across the Sel River, because they've already pushed through in the northern flank, and if it's from the southern flank through Russia or Ukraine, it does not make any difference. In terms of the territorial changes, the Russians are making a new offensive operation towards Pokrovsk, and it has been very quick, despite the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. This points towards the Russians wanting to speed up their offensive operations towards Pokrovsk and to break the defensive positions of the Ukrainians. And this article here by the Financial Times is actually a very interesting perspective on why this is the case. They talk about Ukraine's patchy fortifications that help Russia advance. And in this article, they practically talk about how a lot of money has gone into building fortifications in the Dnipro region, but there's hardly anything that has been built due to corruption, really. And this means that the Russians will not be slowed down that much by these half-assed defensive positions. And this is exactly what the Russians want to take advantage of. If the Russians manage to capture Pokrovsk before the defensive positions are properly prepared, they'll be able to launch offensive operations towards the city of Dnipro, where they'll be able to enter the Dnipropetrovsk region, threaten the supply lines to Zaporizhzhia to cut off the pocket from Dnipro, and launching an offensive towards the city, potentially flanking the remaining parts of the Donetsk region on a wider axis, avoiding the fortified positions within the Donetsk region, or pushing towards Pultava in the north or Kharkiv. In either case, it will be largely unopposed. The Russians have a significant numerical advantage, which will allow them to launch some of these big aero offensives. This would be a beneficial offensive to them in the sense that if they spread out the forces of the Ukrainians further, they'll be able to gain a significant advantage. And if they manage to cut off the Ukrainian forces, either in the Donetsk region or other parts of the front line, they'll be able to isolate them from other sections, avoiding a relocation of their forces, and therefore practically moving into cities unopposed by the Ukrainian military. And therefore, the Russians could launch a large-scale offensive if these defensive positions are not prepared. However, there's also the aspect of mines. If they can get through their minefields, then they'll be able to successfully launch an offensive. If they get stuck within them, they'll be bogged down and they'll be unable to do so. And it could be a risky maneuver where they could lose a lot of equipment, similar to the Ukrainians in the Zaporizhzhia offensive. But again, this was reliant on the Russians having several lines of fortified positions prepared. If we take a look away from that and look back at the start of the war, the Russians managed to make significant gains, and this was largely due to the fact that the Ukrainians did not have many of these fortified positions prepared, other than in the Donetsk region, which has remained within the region since the start of the war. So in conclusion, the Ukrainians are not prepared for a large-scale Russian offensive because they simply have not built necessary fortified positions in the Dnipro region. Following the Russian capture of settlements like Kurakhove, Velikonovosilka, and Pokrovsk, the Russians will be able to and capable of launching offensive operations in the northwestern direction. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.